Hello everyone, welcome to Cyber Platter. Today we will talk about CCSP Domain 2, that is data security, cloud data security. This covers a maximum of the exam content, that is 19%. This is part 2 of Domain 2, part 1. I have added the link in the description. I recommend you to go through it before you actually go through this video. So let's start. First topic is public key infrastructure. Public key infrastructure depends on the trust that participants have in highly trusted centralized service providers. These providers are called as certificate authorities. Certificate authorities verify the identity of individuals and organizations and then issue them digital certificate vouching that the public key associated with that individual or organization actually belongs to them. The certificate authority will ask you to prove your identity following different standards for different individuals or organizations based on what you're requesting for. This may involve simply verifying ownership of a domain name or may be more rigorous and involve physical proof of identity depending upon the type of certificate that you're trying to obtain. Okay. Now let's understand how a security certificate authority creates a digital certificate that associates a public key with an individual or organization. Digital certificate creation uses X509 standard, hence the certificates are sometimes also referred to as X509 certificates. The image explains the process. Suppose, say, requester wants to obtain a new digital certificate. They first create a public-private key pair for the encryption algorithm of their choice. The requester then creates a message called the Certificate Signing Request or CSR. The CSR contains the requested public key as well as their name and other identifying information such as an email address or server name. The requester then sends the CSR to the certificate authority of their choice. This can be an independent organization that is trusted by many people around the world, or it may be a private certificate authority operated for use within an organization. If the certificate authority is an independent party, it is also known as the registration authority. When the certificate authority receives the CSR, it first takes whatever action is necessary to validate the identity of the requester. It is the certificate authority's responsibility to perform sufficient identity verification to put its own seal of approval on the certificate. This is in the best interest of certificate authority because if a certificate authority starts issuing invalid certificate, people will stop trusting it. Once the certificate authority is satisfied that the sender is legitimate, it removes the public key and identity information from the CSR and puts it into the format of an X509 certificate. Okay. The certificate authority then uses its private key to place the certificate authority's digital signature on the digital certificate and send the certificate back to the requester. Okay. The requester may then provide that certificate to anyone who wishes the communication with them. These parties can verify that the certificate is valid by simply checking the certificate authority's digital signature on the certificate is valid or not. If the signature is correct, then the third party knows that the certificate is valid. Topic is revoking a digital certificate. If the certificate owner's private key is compromised, the certificate authority needs a way to revoke the digital certificate so that it can't be used to impersonate the owner. There are two methods for revoking a digital certificate. The first approach is the original approach, that is the Certificate Revocation List or CRL. When the certificate authority wishes to revoke a digital certificate using the CRL, it simply places the serial number of that certificate on the list. Anyone accessing the digital certificate is responsible for downloading the certificate authorities certificate revocation list and verifying that the serial number of the certificate is not included on that list before relying on it. This approach is a little insufficient because it often has time delays and consumes a lot of network bandwidth because everyone on the internet is downloading the list every day from every certificate authority, and the list also keeps growing. Okay, this led to a second approach, that is online certificate status protocol or OCSP. This approach is more interactive. Anyone about to rely upon a digital certificate sends a request to the certificate authority to verify that the certificate is still valid. The certificate authority then checks the serial number of the certificate against its list of revocation, right? And sends back a yes or no response. Most modern web browsers rely on the second option, that is the online certificate status protocol, for determining certificate validity. Next is data discovery. The simple definition of data discovery is that it is a process to find and identify sensitive data, but it has more to it. Data discovery can also mean working on creation of data inventory, collecting and analyzing data to find patterns and gain useful insights like data mining, big data, real-time analytics is also data discovery. Let's talk about the data discovery approaches. The first one is big data, also known as data mining. This is analyzing very large data sets to extract information, useful information, right? Here, along with the large volume, we should also take into consideration the diversity of sources and format of data. High velocity big data also makes data profiling harder and less feasible using traditional methods of data discovery. The next one is real-time analytics. For real-time analytics, I mean nearly real-time, we need faster tools, more automated and more adaptive, right? The next one is agile analytics and agile business intelligence. Data scientists and business intelligence teams are adopting more agile and iterative methods of turning data into business value. They perform data discovery processes more often and in more diverse ways. For example, when profiling new data sets for integration, seeking answers to new questions emerging this week based on last week's new analysis, finding alerts about emerging trends that may warrant a new analysis work streams. Now let's understand data discovery techniques. There are three types of data discovery techniques. The first one is metadata-based discovery. Metadata is the data that describes the data. This is the most common and effective analysis technique. Metadata is often automatically created at the same time as the data. For example, suppose you are creating a file, it is already associated with the date, time, location, data owner, file size, etc. And this is copied and transferred whenever the file itself is copied and transferred. The next one is label-based discovery. The label should be ideally created by the data owners in the create phase of the data lifecycle, but the process can take place at any time during the lifecycle. The data discovery technique, I mean the label one, depends on how accurately the data labels are applied by the data owners. This method is often manual. The next one is content-based discovery. This analysis is actually analyzing the content of the data. This can be as basic as term searches or can use sophisticated pattern matching technology. This form is typically the most thorough form, but it is also the most resource intensive and expensive. That means it becomes slower. Data discovery is much easier to perform on structured data than unstructured data, as the structured data is already very organized, right? For example, structured data like relational databases store metadata that describes table and column attributes. Now let's talk about the common data discovery issues. The first one is the poor data quality. Poor data quality means maybe no labels are there, it is scattered, or data is in various formats. Data visualization tools are only as good as the information that is fed to the tool. The next one is dashboards. When it comes to the dashboard, the main question here is the data accurate? And can critical business decisions rely on this information? Users might modify the data and change fields in the dashboard with no date audit trail, right? And no way to tell who made the changes. This can lead to inaccurate data and hence the business decisions are impacted. The next one is the hidden cost. Memory analytic techniques that are used to increase the business intelligence performance need someone with the right technical skills and background. Hiring the right skilled people for business intelligence is expensive, right? Obviously, the skilled people are expensive nowadays. Now, let's understand the challenges with data discovery in the cloud environment. Because data dispersion and data replication are very common in the cloud environment, knowing where the data is, where it is going, becomes very difficult. Right? Next one is access to data. Not all data stored in the cloud can be accessed easily. For example, the customers might not have the necessary admin rights to access their data on demand. Also, because of the lack of data access, data discovery process might need special configurations, which in turn might result in additional time and expense for the organization. The next one is performing preservation and maintenance. The main question here is who is obligated to preserve and maintain the data? Is it the customer or is it the provider? This needs to be decided between the customers and the provider in the contract. The next topic is data classification. To classify data, it is important to understand where is the data located, what are the data types, what are the access levels implemented, what is the protection level, that is, what are the security controls, or is there any compliance regulations to be considered. Data classification is the process of determining classification categories and labels, then identifying the data, recording its location, and labeling the data. Data classification is the responsibility of the data owner and should take place in the create phase of the data lifecycle. Organization policies will determine what classification is to be used, and this should be uniformly applied. Let's discuss the types of classification. Sensitivity, jurisdiction, and criticality are a few of the classification types that might be used by the organizations. Sensitivity. This model is used by the US military. Here, the consideration is based on what is the negative impact if the data is disclosed to an unauthorized user. The data that is not sensitive is classified as unclassified. The sensitive data is usually classified as confidential, secret, top secret in US military. The geographical location of the source or storage point of the data might have significant bearing on how the data is treated and handled. For example, Personally identifiable information, that is PII data gathered from citizens of the European Union, is subject to the EU privacy laws. These laws are much stricter and more comprehensive than the privacy laws in the United States. Criticality. Here, the classification is based on how much money or operation is impacted if you lose the data. Classification categories can also be data type, context, ownership, contractual or business constraints, obligation for attention and prevention, and so on. Data can also be classified as encrypt or not to encrypt. For data loss prevention solutions, the categories can be internal use and limited sharing. Let's talk about data mapping now. What is data mapping? Data mapping is locating data and recording its location, data format, file types, and data types, like if the data is in the form of database or volume, etc. Data mapping makes sure that the data between organizations are normalized and translated so that it is meaningful to both the parties. That is, the data that is sensitive in one organization is recognized as such by the receiving organization. Topic is data labeling. Data labeling is adding tags to the data by the data owner that describes the data, right? When the data owner creates categories and classifies the data also needs to be labeled. Labels can also be printed headers and footers in hard copy, or it can be as simple as nomenclature for electronic files. Labels can have date of creation, date of scheduled destruction or disposal, confidentiality level, source, etc. Classification is part of data labeling. Next one is sensitive data. Protected health information, PHI, personally identifiable information, PII, and cardholder data are three main categories of highly regulated sensitive data. Protected health information, that is PHI data, is information related to the past, present, or future health status of an individual that was created, used, or obtained in the course of providing healthcare services. This also includes payment services, right? HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act controls who can access the protected health information, under what circumstances can they do it, right? It also regulates elements like data retention, archiving, and other physical and technical safeguards. Personally identifiable information, PII, is any data that could potentially be used to identify a particular individual. PII has two types, direct and indirect identifiers. Direct identifiers can be social security numbers, driver's license, account number, etc. Direct identifiers can be used on their own to identify an individual. Although each standalone indirect identifiers like gender, school name, zip code, etc. cannot identify the individual, the risk is that combining a number of indirect identifiers can result in exposing the subject of the information. Let's talk about intellectual property protections. So first thing first, what is intellectual property? Intellectual property is a work or invention that is the result of creativity such as manuscript or design to which one has rights and for which one may apply for a patent, trademark, copyright, etc. Copyright is for the protection of expressions of ideas. It is granted to anyone who first creates an expression of an idea. Usually, this involves literary works, music, software, artistic works, right? Typically, copyright lasts for either 70 years after the author's death or 120 years after the first publication of a work for hire. Copyright infringement is usually dealt with a civil case. Trademarks. A trademark is meant to protect the goodwill that an organization has built among the marketplace, especially in public perception. Trademark protection is intended to be applied to specific words, graphics, labels, name of the organization. Trademarks last forever as long as the trademark owner continues to use them for commercial purposes. Next one is patent. Patents are to protect inventions, processes, materials, decorations, and plant life. Patents typically last for 20 years from the time of the patent applications. Trade secrets. Trade secrets, as the name suggests, trade secrets are just secrets. They cannot be disclosed to the public, and efforts must be made to maintain secrecy in order to keep this legal protection. Who tries to acquire trade secrets by theft or misappropriation can be sued in civil court. It also lasts forever as long as the owner is still using it in the commercial activity. The next topic is information rights management. Digital rights management (DRM) was designed to focus on security and encryption as a means of preventing unauthorized copying and limitations on distribution of content to only those authorized, that is, the purchasers. DRM is focused specially on the protection of intellectual properties like consumer data, consumer media such as publications, music, movies, and so on. Enterprise Digital Rights Management, also known as Information Rights Management (IRM), is a set of DRM and typically refers to business securing of information rights. IRM is used to protect general institution data, so financial records, personal data, and security profiles would fall under the protection of IRM. It can be used to protect data other than the documents, such as emails, web pages, databases, and so on. Either it is digital or information rights management, the solution entails the use of specific controls that act along with the traditional access control mechanisms. That is, it adds an extra layer of access controls on top of the data's inherent controls. For example, an organization might have an overall access control program that requires users to log into the systems that they use for performing their jobs. Beyond that basic access specific files the user manipulates, such as sensitive financial documents, might have additional protections from IRM or DRM that prevents the users from deleting, modifying, printing, or copying the files. IRM can support data classification and can help protect data throughout the entire data lifecycle phases. Let's talk about some of the IRM challenges in cloud. The first one is heavy management. That is, each individual resource must be provisioned with an access policy. Also, each user must be provisioned with an account and keys. We can consider automation here, automation of enrollment to ease the process, right? The next one is local IRM agent. Most IRM implementations force end users to install a local IRM agent either for key storage or for authenticating and retrieving the IRM content. This feature may limit certain implementations that involves external users. The next one is compatibility issue. When reading IRM protected files, the reader software should be IRM aware. Also, the challenges of IRM compatibility with the different operating systems and different document readers increases when the data needs to be read on mobile devices. The next challenge is replication restrictions. The cloud environment is heavily dependent on replication, but IRM involves preventing unauthorized duplications. Hence, IRM might interfere with automatic resource allocation processes. Jurisdictional conflicts. In cloud, sometimes data is spread across many jurisdictions in a manner unknown or uncontrolled by the data owner. This can be a problem when IRM is restricted by that jurisdiction. Mapping identity and access management and IRM. IRM is an extra layer of access control. Identity and access management of IRM might conflict or cloud identity and access management, or especially with a third party like CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker. The next one is API conflicts. Cloud is heavily dependent on APIs. Because the IRM tool is often incorporated into the content, this might not offer the same level of performance across different applications. IRM capabilities. The first one is persistent protection. The data is protected at all times regardless of its location or data lifecycle phase. That is, continuous protection when the data is at rest, when the data is in transit, in the cloud, or in on premises, and even after the data is distributed. Dynamic policy control. That is, the data owner can use the IRM solution to manage access control lists and permissions even once data has been distributed. That is, it provides granular level of control over the data even once it has been downloaded, shared, or moved to remote storage. Automatic expiration. IRM can automatically revoke access to data after a predetermined lifetime. For example, sometimes when you download documents, you get a message something like this document will self-destruct after a couple of days, maybe 10 days or 20 days, right? The next one is continuous auditing. IRM provides comprehensive monitoring of the contents used and access history. This can also be used as proof of compliance. Replication restrictions. IRM's goal is to stop illegal or unauthorized duplication of protected content. That is, it can disable copying, pasting, screen captures, printing, electronic duplication, email attachments, email format, and so on. Remote rights revocation. That is, the owner of the data should have the ability to revoke those rights at any time. Also remember that IRM can integrate into other security solutions such as data loss prevention and data discovery tools, adding extra benefits. The next one is access models. Mandatory access model is the most restrictive access model. Here, access is granted based on labels such as confidential or secret according to the organization's policy. Role-based access model RBAC grants access based on the user's roles and responsibilities according to the organization policy. Discretion access control is where the access is up to the discretion of the system or data owner. That is, the system or data owner controls who has access to what data. The next topic is data retention policies. Having data in storage is useful. Stored data can be used to correct production errors, can serve as business continuity and business recovery backups, and can be data mined for business intelligence purposes. But remember that the stored data is only useful if it can be accessed or if it can be retrieved and put back into production in an efficient and cost-effective manner during the BCDR activities, that is business continuity and disaster recovery activities. The objectives of a data retention policies are to keep important information for future use or reference so that it can be searched and accessed at a later date, and to dispose of information that is no longer needed. The data Data retention policy addresses the activities that takes place in the archive phase of the data lifecycle. The policy balances the legal, regulation, and business data archival requirements against data storage costs, complexity, and other data considerations. A good data retention policy should include some of the following elements mentioned here. The first one is retention periods. It is the length of time that the organization should keep the data. The retention should be set according to the regulation or legislation or contractual agreements or business needs. The next one talks about the legislation, regulation, and standards requirement. Data retention considerations depend heavily on the data type and the applicable compliance. For example, HIPAA requires some data to be retained for 6 years. PCI DSS requires the organization to keep cardholder data storage to a minimum. The next one is retention formats. This describes how the data is actually archived. That is, what type of media it is stored on and any handling specifications particular to that data. For example, some types of data are required by regulation to be kept encrypted while in storage. Data classification. Data classification. Highly sensitive or regulated data may entail specific retention periods by mandate or contract or best practice. The organization can use the classification level of data to determine how long specific data sets or types of data need to be retained. This can be the other way around as well. Managing data retention in the cloud can be tricky. For example, it may be difficult to ensure that the cloud provider is not retaining the organization's data beyond the retention period. Archival and retrieval procedures. The policy should mandate the creation of a detailed description of the process of both for sending data into storage and for recovering it. The process might require more frequent updates and retrieval might be included as an attachment to the policy or mentioned by reference to the actual documentation of the process. The next one is monitoring, maintenance, and enforcement. These are the procedures for making sure the entire process is working as expected, including review of the policy and requirements to make sure that there are no changes. The next one is data deletion procedures and mechanisms. A key part of data protection procedure is the safe disposal of data once it is no longer needed. Let's consider the data deletion options in traditional environment. The first one is physical destruction of hardware. Methods like burning, melting, drilling, grinding, industrial shredding, so on can be used here. This is the preferred method of sanitization because the data is physically unrecoverable. Next one is degaussing. Degaussing uses strong magnetic fields to scramble data on magnetic medium such as hard drive and tapes. Degaussing does not work with solid state drives. Next one is overwriting. Writing random data over the actual data. The more times the overwriting process occurs, the more thorough the destruction of the data is considered to be. Crypto shredding. Customers mostly don't have physical access to the medium. Physical destruction and degaussing cannot be performed in cloud. Because of high replication and dispersion, it is difficult to know the actual specific physical location, and it would be next to impossible to determine all the components and media that would need to be destroyed. Hence, overwriting is not a practical method of sanitization in the cloud. In multi-tenant environment, a customer cannot physically destroy or overwrite storage space or media as that would affect other customers' data. Hence, crypto shredding is the best option for data sanitization in the cloud. A good data disposal policy should have the following elements like the process of data disposal, a clear step-by-step procedure of how the data should be disposed and what is agreed by the organization policy should be mentioned here, right? What are the applicable regulations? Means if you're using some medical records, then HIPAA comes into play. If you're using credit card data, then PCI DSS comes into play. So we have to make sure we consider all that. There should be clear direction of when data should be destroyed, at what phase, who's going to decide this, right? Next topic is data archiving procedures and mechanisms. Data archiving is the process of identifying and moving inactive data from a production system into a long-term archival storage system. Why do we need to do this, right? Because moving inactive data out of production systems optimizes the performance of resources needed in the production systems. Also, long-term cloud storage is less expensive than production system storage. That is, it is less expensive because it may take several hours to complete the data retrieval process, not like instantly available like production data. Also, data that is no longer needed for day-to-day use, but that is required to be maintained as part of an organization's data retention policy is typically archived until it is either needed or deleted. Let's discuss some of the items to be included in the data archiving policy. Data encryption procedures. Long-term data archiving with an encryption can present a challenge for the organization with regard to key management. Bad key management can lead to data breaches, and also if keys are not available, the data will not be accessible. So the encryption policy should consider which media is used, what is the restoration options, what threat should be mitigated by the encryption, and so on. Data monitoring procedures. Data that is stored in cloud tends to be replicated and moved around. To maintain data governance, it is required that all data access and movements to be tracked and logged. The next one is ability to perform e-discovery and granular retrieval. The archiving platform should provide the ability to perform e-discovery on the data to determine which data should be retrieved. Also, we should be able to retrieve archive data according to certain parameters such as dates, subjects, owners, etc. Right? The next one is backup and disaster recovery options. Requirements for data backup and restore should be specified and clearly documented. It is important to ensure that the business continuity and disaster recovery plans are updated and aligned with whatever procedures are implemented. Data format and media types. The format of the data is very important for extended period of time. If storage, I mean, if you're using it for a long period, right, the data is stored. Data format and media types. The format of the data is very important for extended period of time storage. Using standard format and media types is a recommended option. For example, MS Office 98 documents may be impossible to open in a newer MS Office version. Data restore and testing. This should be done periodically to make sure the process is working. Detailed step-by-step procedure for data restoration should be documented. Let's discuss legal hold. If an organization is involved in litigation, that is, any pending action, legal action is pending by the organization, they may be notified of required compliance with a litigation hold or a legal hold. Legal hold is a process of preserving any data that is or will or may be relevant during a legal investigation. Organizations may be required to collect and produce information to the other party in the dispute through an electronic discovery. process. Legal hold supersedes the organization's data retention and destruction policies. At this point, the organization must show good faith and efforts in preserving any data related to the case until the obligation no longer applies. Cloud customers, that is, the data owners, should consider potential legal hold roles and responsibilities when negotiating cloud contracts and SLAs with the cloud service providers. Now let's talk about auditability, traceability, and accountability of data events. This is how to identify, track, and analyze data events to ensure ongoing security in an organization's environment. Remember that OWASP, that is Open Web Application Security Project, provides a great resource on logging. Event sources can be systems, services, or devices that create and provide log events for analysis. Understanding the shared responsibility model is essential for maintaining data security as well as ensuring compliance with any legal or regulatory requirements that the organization is accountable for. Information about individual event entries in logs is called event attributes. Some of the event attributes are timestamp, event ID, application ID, IP addresses, URL information, etc. Right? Like source address, that is the user's device or machine IP address, and user identity like username helps to answer the question, who did this? To know what happened, we can consider the attributes like type of event, severity of the event, like is it an error, warning, information, debug, and also we can consider description of what happened. To understand where it happened, we can consider application identifiers, that is the name and version of the application. Application address like the host name or workstation identity, service name and protocol, geolocation details, and so on. Software as a service event sources. Cloud customers have minimal access to event data or logs in software as a service model. The customers will most likely have the access to only the high-level application log data generated on client endpoints. To understand what level of access you have, you should pay close attention to terms in your SLAs and cloud contracts. Some of the events to be considered here are admin logs, web server logs, application logs, billing logs, and so on. PaaS event sources. As platform as a service is usually used for development and testing activities, the application development teams will have better understanding of what logs are available and how to access them. PaaS cloud environments provide a combination of infrastructure level event sources and application level event sources that are customized by the organization's app developers. Some of the events in PaaS as a service model are input validation failures, application and related system startup and shutdowns, and logging initialization, use of high-risk functionality, output validation failures, authentication details, authorization failures, session management failures, and so on. Infrastructure as a service event sources. Organizations using the infrastructure as a service model will have maximum access to logs and event sources of any cloud service category. Some of the event sources here are network logs, hypervisor logs, VM logs, host OS logs, API access logs, billing records, etc. The next topic is chain of custody and non-repudiation. First, let's discuss about chain of custody. If evidence may be used in court, forensic analysts should document every step of the collection, analysis, and storage process. This is called as chain of custody. that is to protect and preserve the evidence throughout its life cycle. Evidence can be physical or electronic. The chain of custody form should be used to document the following elements: date and time of when the evidence was collected, where the evidence is located, during which dates and who placed it there. This mainly talks about the storage of evidence, right? Because where the evidence is located is the storage. Transfer of evidence, that is from whom to whom and when and how. Who had access to the evidence? When was it accessed? How was it accessed? The next one is what analysis was performed on the evidence. Again, the same details. That is like who analyzed it, when was it analyzed, what tools were used to do this, and so on. Chain of custody in the cloud can be very difficult. We can include the level of cloud service provider cooperation with chain of custody practices in the cloud contract. The next topic is non-repudiation. This concept makes sure that someone cannot deny something. Non-repudiation provides assurance that an individual created a specific item, for example, file or email with digital signature of the creator. It also provides assurance of actions. For example, confirming that a particular user logged into a system or made a change to a file. The next concept is security information and event management. Monitoring tools play a vital role in knowing how well the system and security controls are functioning to detect suspicious activity and to enforce policy. A large part of the monitoring effort comes in the form of logs. A security information and event management collects, aggregates, and indexes logs from multiple sources and makes those logs easily searched and analyzed. Let's talk about the capabilities of SIEM. The first one is centralized collection of log data, that is gathering the data from many sources and aggregating them into a single index searchable collection of data. The primary benefit of log aggregation is that it gives you the ability to search and analyze multiple sources of data from a single point. This saves security analysts a great deal of time associated with logging into different systems and potentially forgetting to check one or more sources. This does create an additional risk. That is, having all the data in one location makes the location very attractive target for attackers. So any SIEM's implementation will require additional layers of security controls. The second capability is enhanced analysis. SIEM can identify and connect common attributes amongst separate data sources in order to provide useful information. Log analysis is a mundane, repetitive task. One way to help security analysts with log analysis is automation. Something to remember about automation is that most automated tools will not recognize the slow and low style of persistent threads. These threads may develop over a long period and don't have any dramatic indicators, hence will be missed by SIEM alerts. The next one is alerting. Once the data is aggregated and the event information is correlated, the security information and event management tools will alert you of potential security events or incidents. This occurs around the clock and can be configured to trigger in real time based on specific users, actions, error codes, and other parameters. The next one is dashboarding. SIEM offers graphical output display of multiple alerts and data points. This is very much useful for presenting the data to the management, where the managers can quickly grasp the situation within the environment. This will be all for this episode. If you liked it, if you learned something from this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you guys. See you in the next video. Bye.